The town of Maple Hollow was small, quiet, and surrounded by golden fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Everyone knew everyone else there. They knew who baked the best pies, who owned the biggest farm, and who went to church every Sunday. It was the kind of place where nothing stayed secret for long, except for the mystery of the little girl no one talked to. Her name was Lila. She was 8 years old. Though she looked smaller, maybe 6 because she was thin and pale, she wore the same faded dress every day, one that used to be white but had turned gray from dirt and time. Her shoes didn't match. One had no sole, the other had a broken strap. Her hair was long and tangled, and it hung in messy strands over her face. But the thing everyone noticed most about her was the smell, a strong, unpleasant odor that seemed to follow her wherever she went. It made people wrinkle their noses and step aside when she passed. Children at school whispered about her. "She never takes a bath," one would say. "I heard she lives in the woods," another would whisper. Sometimes they would giggle behind her back or move their desks away when she came near. Lila didn't say anything. She just sat alone, quiet as a mouse, her hands folded on her desk, eyes fixed on her notebook. When the teacher called her name, her voice came out soft and uncertain, like she was afraid of using it. At recess, she would stand by the fence watching the others play jump rope or tag, her small fingers gripping the wire tightly. She wanted to join them so badly, but she knew they wouldn't let her. The last time she tried, one of the girls had screamed and told her to go away because of that smell. Since then, Lila had stopped trying. No one knew exactly where Lila came from. Some said she lived on the edge of town in an old shed. Others thought she might have run away from home. A few believed her parents had left her behind. But no one asked her, and she never told. The townspeople pretended not to see her, as if she were invisible. When she walked into the small grocery store, the shopkeeper frowned and followed her with his eyes, afraid she might steal something. But Lila never did. She would just stare at the apples and bread, her stomach rumbling, and then quietly leave empty-handed. There was a sadness about her, something deep and heavy that didn't belong on a child's face. Every morning she would walk along the dirt road with a small bag over her shoulder, picking up bottles or bits of metal to trade for coins. It wasn't much, but it helped her buy bread once in a while. Sometimes she'd find leftovers thrown away behind the diner, cold biscuits or half-eaten sandwiches, and she would save them carefully for later. It was a hard life, but she had learned to survive. At night, when the sun went down and the air grew cold, Lila would crawl under an old wooden porch behind an abandoned house. It was dusty and dark, but it was dry when it rained. She had a blanket that was more holes than fabric, and she wrapped herself in it tightly, pretending she was being hugged by someone who cared. Before falling asleep, she would look at the stars through the cracks in the porch and whisper to herself, "Tomorrow will be better," she'd say softly. "Maybe someone will talk to me tomorrow." But tomorrow was always the same. One morning, Lila walked into town with her head down, her long hair hiding most of her face. The bakery on Main Street smelled like warm bread and cinnamon, and the scent made her stomach twist with hunger. She stood outside, watching through the window as a woman handed out pastries to smiling customers. A small crumb had fallen to the ground, and when no one was looking, Lila crouched down to pick it up. But the woman saw her through the glass and quickly closed the door. "Go away, child," she said firmly, her voice sharp but not cruel. "You're making people uncomfortable." Lila backed away without saying a word. She had heard that kind of thing before. The hurt in her chest was something she had learned to hide. As the day went on, the sun grew hotter, and the dust from the road stuck to her skin. She stopped by the water pump near the school and tried to wash her face, but the pump handle was broken. She looked at her reflection in the muddy water puddle below. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt, her lips dry and cracked. "You're okay," she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled. That afternoon, she walked to the back of the general store where the trash bins were. The smell there was strong, but she didn't mind. She carefully searched through the garbage, hoping to find a bruised apple or a bit of bread that hadn't spoiled. It was there, behind those bins, that Tom Callahan first saw her. Tom was a tall man with a rough beard and sunburned skin, a rancher who spent most of his days working with horses and cattle. He wasn't one to talk much, but everyone in town respected him. He had a quiet way about him, like the land itself, strong, steady, and kind beneath the surface. That day he had come to town for supplies. When he walked around the back of the store to load feed sacks into his truck, He saw the small figure bent over the trash. At first, he thought it was an animal. Then he realized it was a child, thin, barefoot, and trembling. "Hey there," he said gently, stepping closer. Lila froze. She didn't turn around. She was holding a half-eaten apple she had just found, and her hands shook. "It's okay," Tom said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She finally looked up. Her eyes were wide, green like spring grass but filled with fear. Dirt smudged her face and her hair clung to her cheeks. The smell hit him a second later, strong and sour, and for a moment he took a step back without meaning to. But then he stopped himself. He had seen wounded animals before, scared, defensive, ready to run, and he knew that one wrong move would send her fleeing. "You hungry?" he asked, holding out a shiny red apple from his bag. Lila stared at it, then at him. She didn't move. "Go on," he said quietly. "It's clean." After a long pause, she reached out and took it, her fingers barely brushing his. She didn't thank him, not because she wasn't grateful, but because she had forgotten what it felt like to be treated kindly. Tom watched as she took a small bite, then another, eating slowly like she was afraid the food might vanish if she went too fast. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated before whispering, "Lila." "That's a pretty name," Tom said. "You live around here?" She looked down and shrugged. "Sometimes," she mumbled. Tom frowned. There were 100 questions he wanted to ask. Where her family was, if she was safe. But he could see she was ready to bolt. So he just nodded. "All right then. You take care of yourself, Lila." She nodded too, clutching the apple tightly, and before he could say another word, she ran off down the alley. Tom watched her go, her small figure disappearing into the sunlight, and he felt something heavy settle in his chest. That night, while sitting on his porch, Tom couldn't get her out of his mind. He thought about her thin arms, the way she flinched when he spoke, the smell that made others turn away. He had seen neglected animals before, horses left too long without care, and he had always taken them in, fed them, and given them a chance to heal. But this was a child, and no one seemed to care. In town, the gossip continued. "She's been hanging around again," one woman said. "Someone ought to call the sheriff," said another. But no one did. They just kept talking while Lila wandered the streets, hungry and invisible. That night, as the wind howled across the open fields, Lila sat alone behind the old church, hugging her knees for warmth. She closed her eyes and thought about the man who had given her the apple, the only person who hadn't yelled or pushed her away. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of hope. Maybe there really were people in the world who could see her, not just smell the dirt or the pain. She didn't know it yet, but that one kind gesture was about to change her life forever. For the next few days after Tom Callahan saw the little girl behind the store, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The image of her small hands clutching the apple stayed in his mind. He had met many people in his life, but none had looked at him the way that child did, with fear and hope mixed together. It wasn't the kind of look you could forget. Every morning, Tom woke up before sunrise to take care of his ranch. He fed the horses, mended fences, and checked on the cattle grazing in the open fields. It was hard, lonely work, but he liked it that way. The quiet helped him think. Still, for the first time in years, his thoughts weren't about the weather, the animals, or the work ahead. They kept going back to that thin little girl with the tired eyes. He wondered where she slept at night, what she ate, and if anyone looked out for her. He told himself it wasn't his business, that she'd probably find her way somehow. But the thought didn't rest easy. Every time he passed through town, he found his eyes searching the alleys and corners, hoping to catch sight of her again. But for several days, she was nowhere to be found. One evening, as the sun began to set, Tom drove back home along the dusty road that led to his ranch. The air was cool, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. He was tired from the day's work and looking forward to a quiet supper. But as his truck rounded the bend near his barn, he saw something that made him hit the brakes. There, curled up beside the old wooden fence, was a small shape, still and fragile. For a moment, Tom thought it might be a stray dog. But when he stepped closer, his heart clenched. It was Lila. She was lying on the ground, her knees tucked close to her chest, clutching her worn blanket. Her face was pale, and her lips trembled even though the evening wasn't yet cold. There was a faint trace of dried mud on her cheeks, and her hair was tangled more than ever. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't eaten or slept properly in days. Tom knelt beside her and spoke softly. "Lila, you okay, sweetheart?" Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him, she gasped and tried to sit up. Fear flashed across her face. "I'll go," she stammered, already gathering her things. No, Tom said quickly, raising his hands gently. "It's all right. You're not in trouble." She hesitated, watching him closely. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Calm, kind, without shouting. "I didn't mean to come here," she whispered. "I was just tired." "I can see that," Tom said softly. "When did you last eat?" She shrugged. "Yesterday, I think." Her voice was small, like a bird afraid to sing. Tom looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Come on, let's get you inside. You can have something to eat." Lila's eyes widened. "Inside? Your house?" She sounded unsure, almost frightened of the idea. He nodded. "Just for supper. You can leave after if you want." She didn't move at first, her thin hands tightening around her blanket. But the promise of food was too strong to ignore. After a moment, she nodded slowly. Tom smiled gently and helped her to her feet. She was so light that he worried she might faint if she stood too long. As they walked toward the small farmhouse, Tom noticed how she kept a few steps behind him, as though ready to run at any moment. When they reached the porch, she hesitated again, glancing up at the warm light spilling from the window. "It's all right," Tom said. "You're welcome here." Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and stew. It was simple but cozy: a stone fireplace, an old rug, and a small table set for one. Tom had lived alone for years since his wife passed away, and though he had learned to live with the quiet, it suddenly felt less lonely with the sound of small footsteps behind him. He poured her a bowl of stew and placed it on the table. "Go on. Eat while it's warm." Lila sat down carefully, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected someone else to appear. Then she took a small spoonful, and her eyes filled with tears. She hadn't tasted real food in so long that it almost didn't feel real. Tom pretended not to notice her tears and busied himself with his coffee. "You can have more if you want," he said when she finished the first bowl. She hesitated but nodded, holding out the bowl with both hands. He smiled and filled it again. When she was done, she sat quietly, her eyes heavy. Tom noticed how she kept rubbing her arms, trying to stay warm. "You must be freezing," he said. "There's a blanket by the fire." She didn't move. "I don't want to make trouble," she whispered. "You're not," he said. "Just rest a bit. You look like you could use it." For a long while they sat in silence, the fire crackling, the clock ticking softly. Tom watched her drift between wakefulness and sleep, her body swaying slightly with exhaustion. Finally, she curled up on the floor beside the fire, her small head resting on her arms, and within minutes she was asleep. Tom stood there for a long time, his heart heavy. He had seen loneliness before, in the eyes of old widows and wandering animals. But this was different. No child should look that empty, that forgotten. He quietly fetched an extra blanket and covered her with it. Then he sat in his chair and stared into the fire, his mind restless. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her go back out there alone. The next morning, Lila woke up to the smell of eggs and toast. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The room was warm, sunlight streaming through the curtains. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, her blanket slipping off her shoulders. Then she saw Tom at the stove, humming softly to himself. "You slept all night," he said, turning with a smile. "Feel better?" She nodded shyly. "Yes. Thank you." "Eat first," he said. "Then we'll see about getting you cleaned up a bit." At the word cleaned, Lila's face changed. She froze, staring at him in alarm. "You mean a bath?" she whispered. Tom paused. Yeah, just a bath, that's all. You don't have to worry. But Lila looked terrified. I don't want to, she said quickly. Please don't make me. Tom walked over slowly and crouched down so they were eye level. Hey now, he said gently. I'm not going to make you do anything you don't want to. But it's warm water and soap, that's all. You'll feel better, I promise. She bit her lip and looked away. For a moment, Tom thought she might refuse. Then she gave a tiny nod. He filled the old iron tub in the washroom, adding soap until bubbles rose to the surface. The water steamed gently, filling the air with a clean, soft scent. When she saw it, Lila hesitated at the door. It's okay, Tom said. You can take your time. I'll be right outside if you need anything. It took her a while, but when she finally stepped into the water, she let out a small gasp. It was warm, maybe the first warmth she had felt in months. The dirt washed away slowly, layer by layer, revealing the soft skin beneath. For the first time, she saw her reflection in the mirror and hardly recognized herself. When she came out, Tom handed her a clean towel and a set of old clothes from a box. They were a bit big for her, but they were clean and smelled of soap. These were my nieces, he said with a smile. Haven't had a reason to take them out in years. She looked at herself again, then at him. Thank you, she said quietly. Her voice was small, but it was the first time she had spoken without fear. That night, Tom made her a bed in the spare room, a little cot with soft blankets. You can stay here as long as you need to, he told her. You're safe here. Lila stared at him for a long moment as if trying to believe it. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was faint, unsure, but it was there. The first smile he had ever seen on her face. As Tom turned off the light and walked back to his room, he felt something shift inside him. The ranch had always been quiet, too quiet, but now there was something new in the air. Something small, fragile, but alive. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. The next morning, sunlight poured gently through the curtains of the small farmhouse. The soft sound of birds outside mixed with the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee. Tom Callahan sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, though his eyes weren't really on the words. His mind kept wandering to the little girl asleep in the spare room, Lila. It had been years since the house had anyone else inside it. Ever since his wife passed away, the rooms had stayed quiet, filled only with the hum of the old clock and the crackle of the fireplace. But now, with a child under his roof, the place felt alive in a way it hadn't for a long time. He didn't know much about raising children, but something deep inside told him he was doing the right thing. When he heard small footsteps behind him, he turned. Lila stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket that nearly reached the floor. Her hair was still tangled, though a little less wild than before. She looked shy, uncertain whether she was welcome. "Mornin', sleepyhead," Tom said kindly. "Did you get some rest?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "You don't have to call me sir," he said with a smile. "Just Tom will do." Lila's lips curved into the faintest smile before she sat down at the table. He placed a plate in front of her, warm pancakes with honey and butter. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she simply stared at the food as if afraid to touch it. "Go ahead," he said. "They won't bite." She giggled softly, the sound light and quick like a small bell. Then she picked up the fork and began to eat. Each bite was slow, careful, almost reverent. Tom pretended not to notice how her hands shook or how she closed her eyes every few seconds, as though savoring not just the food but the kindness behind it. When she finished, he poured her a cup of warm milk and said, "We've got a lot to do today. You can help me feed the animals if you like." Lila's eyes lit up. "Really?" "Really," he nodded. "But first we've got to get you cleaned up properly." The words made her freeze. The light in her eyes dimmed a little. "You mean another bath?" she asked quietly. Tom hesitated, realizing how tense she suddenly looked. "Just a simple one," he said gently. "You don't have to be scared. I'll make sure the water's nice and warm." She looked down at her lap, twisting her fingers together. "I never liked baths," she whispered. They used to yell when I took too long." Tom's heart tightened, though he kept his voice calm. "No one's going to yell here, Lila. You can take all the time you want." She glanced up at him, unsure if she could believe that. But his face was steady, kind, and patient. Finally, she gave a small nod. Tom went to fill the old iron tub again, just like before. He added warm water and soap until bubbles danced on the surface. The scent of lavender filled the air, light and calming. He placed a towel nearby and laid out the same clean clothes from yesterday. Soft, simple, and freshly washed. When he told her it was ready, she stood at the doorway again, holding the edge of her blanket like a shield. "It smells nice," she said softly. "That's the soap," he replied. "Good kind. My wife used to make it herself. Guess it still works." She smiled a little at that, then took a careful step inside. Tom turned to leave, giving her privacy. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be outside feeding the chickens. Just holler if you need anything." He closed the door behind him and stepped out into the yard. The morning air was cool and fresh. The chickens clucked happily as he scattered their feed. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the small figure inside the house. He hoped she wasn't too frightened. Inside, Lila stood by the tub staring at the water. It looked clean and inviting, and she could see faint clouds of steam rising. She hesitated, her heart beating fast. Part of her wanted to run. It felt strange being cared for like this. But another part of her wanted to trust him. After a moment, she took a deep breath and stepped closer. When her foot touched the water, she gasped softly. It was warm, not hot, not cold, just perfect. Slowly, she lowered herself in. The warmth spread through her thin body, easing the ache in her muscles. She closed her eyes, letting the water surround her. She stayed there for a long time, scrubbing her arms and legs gently with the soap. The dirt came away in dark streaks, swirling through the water until it turned cloudy. As it did, something in her heart seemed to lift. She began to hum softly, a tune she barely remembered from long ago, something her mother used to sing before things went bad. When she finally got out, she wrapped herself in the towel and stood before the small mirror hanging on the wall. For a long moment, she just stared. The face looking back at her didn't seem like hers. Her cheeks were pink now, her hair no longer clumped together but soft and shiny. Her eyes, wide and green, sparkled in the light. She touched her face gently as if checking to see if it was really her. Then, for the first time in years, she smiled. Not a shy smile, but a real one. When she stepped outside, Tom was waiting near the porch. He turned and blinked in surprise. For a moment, he couldn't even speak. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "You look like a brand new person." Lila laughed. A light musical laugh that carried across the open air. "It feels nice," she said. "Like I'm someone else." Tom smiled warmly. "No, not someone else. Just you. The way you were meant to be." She blushed a little, not used to hearing kind words about herself. Then he handed her a small comb. "Here, try brushing that hair of yours. Can't have the horses thinking you're one of them." She giggled again and began to brush her hair, the tangles coming loose with each stroke. Tom watched her for a while, his heart full. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed laughter in his home. After breakfast, he took her out to the barn. The animals stirred curiously as they entered. The horses whinnied and the dogs wagged their tails. "They like you already," Tom said. "Animals can tell when someone's good inside." Lila smiled shyly and reached out to pet one of the horses. The big brown mare lowered her head, nuzzling Lila's shoulder. She laughed and gently stroked its mane. "She's so soft," she whispered. "That's Daisy," Tom said. "She's been with me a long time." All morning they worked side by side, feeding the animals, filling water troughs, and sweeping the barn floor. Tom noticed how quick Lila was to learn, how carefully she handled every creature, speaking softly to them as if they were her friends. It warmed him to see her come alive. When the chores were done, they sat on the porch steps together, drinking lemonade. The sun was high now, and the air buzzed with the sound of cicadas. Lila leaned back against the railing, her eyes half closed in the sunlight. "You like it here?" Tom asked quietly. She nodded. "It's peaceful," she said. "Nobody yells. Nobody runs away." Tom looked at her thoughtfully. "You can stay as long as you want, Lila. There's room here for both of us." She turned to him, her eyes bright with surprise. "Really?" "Really," he said. "This house has been too quiet for too long. Could use a little laughter again." Her throat tightened and she looked down at her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "No one ever said that to me before." Tom smiled gently. "Well, there's a first time for everything." That night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Lila helped him close up the barn and light the lamps. The ranch glowed in the soft orange light, peaceful and alive. When she went to bed, she lay awake for a long while, listening to the crickets outside and the steady creak of the porch swing where Tom sat. For the first time in her young life, she wasn't afraid of the dark. She wasn't hungry or cold or unwanted. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about the warm water, the gentle words, and the feeling of safety she had never known before. And somewhere deep inside, a little piece of her heart began to heal. Days turned into weeks, and the little farmhouse that once stood in silence was now filled with life again. The sound of footsteps, laughter, and gentle singing floated through its rooms. Tom Callahan had never imagined that the quiet rancher's life he lived for years would suddenly change because of one small girl. But that's exactly what happened. Every morning before the sun rose above the hills, Lila would wake up early. She would peek through her window and watch the sky turn pink and gold. The roosters would crow, the horses would stir, and she would slip out of bed, pull on her clean clothes, and hurry to the kitchen. Tom would already be there, frying eggs or pouring coffee. He would smile when he saw her. "Morning, sunshine," he'd say. "Ready to start the day?" Lila would nod eagerly. "Can I feed Daisy today?" "Sure can," Tom would reply, handing her a bucket of oats. At first, Lila had been shy and uncertain, afraid of doing something wrong. But Tom never scolded her. If she spilled water or dropped a pail, he would just chuckle and say, "We all learn best by making a little mess." Slowly, she began to relax. She started to hum while working, to skip when she carried feed, and sometimes she even told stories about the clouds she saw above the fields. The ranch animals loved her. Daisy, the brown mare, followed her around like a faithful dog. The sheep gathered near her when she sang softly, and the dogs wagged their tails whenever she appeared. Tom noticed it with quiet pride. It was as if the animals sensed her heart, gentle, patient, and kind. One warm afternoon, Tom decided to take Lila into town for supplies. She hadn't been back since that day he found her digging through the trash, and he wondered how she'd feel returning now. As they rode in his old truck, Lila sat quietly, her small hands gripping her dress. "Do you think people will stare?" she asked. Tom glanced at her. "Maybe. But you don't need to worry about that. You just walk proud, Lila. You've got nothing to be ashamed of." She nodded, though her eyes stayed fixed on the dusty road ahead. When they reached the general store, heads did turn. The townsfolk who had once avoided her now looked with surprise. The little girl who used to wander the streets dirty and alone was almost unrecognizable. Clean, neat and smiling shyly beside the rancher. Mrs. Hargrove, the baker's wife, came forward with a curious expression. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "Is that little Lila?" Tom nodded. "Sure is. She's been helping me on the ranch." The woman blinked. She looked so different. Lila lowered her gaze, unsure what to say. But Mrs. Hargrove smiled kindly and handed her a small bag. "Here," she said. "A few cookies. Fresh from the oven." Lila's eyes widened. "For me?" "Of course, sweetheart." That simple act made something warm bloom in Lila's chest. For so long, people had turned away from her. Now someone was being kind. She thanked the woman softly and held the bag close as if it were a treasure. Tom noticed the sparkle in her eyes. He didn't say anything, but inside he felt proud. Proud that the girl everyone once ignored now stood tall, clean, and happy. When they returned home, Lila ran to the barn with her cookies. She broke one in half and offered it to Daisy. "It's good," she whispered. "You'd like it too." The horse nudged her hand gently and Lila laughed. A sound so pure and full of joy that it reached Tom all the way from the porch. That night, after supper, they sat outside watching the stars. The air was cool, and the soft sounds of crickets filled the space between them. Lila looked up and said, "It's so pretty here. I like the stars. They don't laugh at me." Tom looked at her kindly. "Nobody's laughing at you anymore, Lila, not here." She turned to him, her face thoughtful. "Why did you help me, Tom?" "You didn't have to." He took a deep breath, looking out at the dark fields. "You reminded me of someone I once knew. My little girl. She didn't get the chance to grow up." Lila's eyes softened. "You had a daughter?" Tom nodded. "A long time ago. She got sick when she was about your age." His voice was quiet, steady, After she passed, the house felt too empty. I stopped talking much, stopped looking for company. Guess I figured the world didn't have much left for me. He looked at her then, his voice gentle. But then you came along. This brave little thing with messy hair and the strongest heart I ever saw. Maybe I didn't save you, Lila. Maybe you saved me. Lila felt tears fill her eyes. She didn't know what to say, so she just leaned closer and rested her head against his arm. Tom didn't move for a while, but then he placed a hand on her shoulder and gave it a small, comforting squeeze. After that evening, their bond grew even stronger. They worked side by side each day, fixing fences, washing the horses, and planting vegetables in the small garden behind the house. Tom taught Lila how to hold the reins, how to tell when a horse was nervous, and how to ride slowly and steady. The first time she sat on Daisy's back, her hands trembled. I might fall, she said. Tom chuckled softly. If you do, I'll catch you. Now hold tight. She did, and as Daisy began to walk, Lila's laughter echoed across the field. I'm really doing it, she cried. Tom smiled so wide his eyes crinkled. You sure are. By the end of the week, she was trotting across the field with confidence, her hair flying in the wind, her laughter carrying like music. The neighbors passing by the ranch would stop and watch, amazed at the change in her. The little girl who once walked with her head down now sat tall and fearless on a horse. In the evenings, Lila loved to help with supper. She learned how to stir stew, how to make biscuits, and how to set the table. I never knew cooking could be fun, she'd say with a grin. That's because it's more fun when you've got company, Tom would reply. Sometimes, when they finished eating, Tom would take out his old guitar, something he hadn't touched in years. He'd strum a few soft tunes while Lila hummed along. Her voice was gentle and sweet, filling the air with warmth. The ranch, once quiet and lonely, now felt like home again. There were flowers on the windowsill, laughter in the kitchen, and the sound of two people who had found peace in each other's company. But Lila still had moments when her past crept back. Sometimes she would wake up in the night, crying softly from dreams she couldn't shake. When that happened, Tom would sit with her until she calmed down, never asking questions, just staying close so she wouldn't feel alone. You're safe now, he'd whisper. Nobody's gonna hurt you here, and she believed him. One Sunday afternoon, the townsfolk held a small fair near the church. Tom thought it might be good for Lila to go to meet other children again. She was nervous, but she agreed. When they arrived, some of the adults greeted them politely. The children whispered a bit. Old habits die hard. But when one girl smiled and asked if Lila wanted to play tag, she said yes. For the next hour, laughter echoed through the field as Lila ran and played like any other child. Her cheeks flushed, her hair glimmered in the sunlight, and she looked free, truly free. Tom watched from the sidelines, his heart full. Later, when it was time to go, one of the mothers came up to him. You've done a wonderful thing for that child, she said softly. Tom shook his head. No, ma'am. She's the one who's done something wonderful for me. That night back at the ranch, Lila helped him close the barn doors and feed the horses one last time before bed. Tom, she said, looking up at him, I think I finally know what home feels like. Tom felt his throat tighten. He smiled and said, Good, because you're home, Lila, for as long as you want to be. She smiled back, her eyes shining in the dim light. Then she hugged him, small arms wrapping around his waist. For a moment, Tom just stood still, surprised. Then he placed his rough, gentle hand on her head and whispered, You're safe, sweetheart. You're home. As the stars came out and the night settled quietly over the ranch, Tom realized that the house wasn't just full of sound again. It was full of love. And Lila, the girl once shunned for her smell, now carried a warmth inside her that could never be washed away. Seasons changed quietly around Maple Hollow. The golden fields turned green with spring, and then back to gold as summer came again. Life on the ranch flowed peacefully, like a calm river after a long storm. Every day began with the soft crow of roosters and ended with the glow of stars. Lila had grown stronger and happier in every way. Her cheeks were round with color, her hair shone in the sunlight, and her laughter had become a familiar sound that filled every corner of the house. She no longer walked with her head down. Now she moved with confidence, her steps light and full of purpose. The townsfolk who once whispered about her had changed too. When they saw her riding Daisy down the main road beside Tom, they waved. Some even called her name. She would smile and wave back shyly, still not used to the warmth of people's kindness. Tom had never been prouder. He watched her with quiet satisfaction, always amazed by how far she had come. She had brought life back to his home and to his heart. One sunny morning, Lila was helping Tom in the garden. She wore an old straw hat that was far too big for her, and every few minutes it slipped down over her eyes, making Tom chuckle. "You keep that up and I'll have to tie that hat to your chin," he teased. She giggled. "Then I'd look like a baby." "Maybe, but at least you'd see where you're walking." They laughed together as they planted tomato seedlings in neat rows. The smell of fresh soil filled the air, and the sun warmed their backs. After they finished, Lila wiped her forehead and said, "Tom, do you think I could go to school again someday?" Tom looked at her thoughtfully. "You sure can if that's what you want." "Why do you ask?" She hesitated, then said, I want to learn things, and maybe make friends. I'm not scared anymore." Tom's heart swelled with pride. "You've got nothing to be scared of, Lila. You're one brave little lady." She smiled at his words. And that afternoon he drove into town to talk to the school teacher. When Lila returned to school the next week, she was nervous but excited. The classroom looked smaller than she remembered, and the children stared for a moment before whispering softly to one another. But this time no one laughed or pointed. The teacher introduced her with a smile. "Everyone, this is Lila. She'll be joining our class again." A few of the girls waved. One of them, a cheerful girl named Mary, scooted over to make room at her desk. "You can sit with me," she said brightly. Lila hesitated only for a moment before sitting down beside her. For the first time, she wasn't the outcast sitting alone. By lunchtime, she was laughing with the others, sharing stories about life on the ranch and the funny things Daisy the horse did. When she came home that afternoon, her smile was so wide that Tom couldn't help but laugh. "Someone had a good day," he said. "I made a friend," she said proudly. "Two, actually." Tom ruffled her hair. "That's my girl." From that day on, things only got better. Lila loved her lessons and worked hard to catch up. The teacher said she was bright and curious, and Tom couldn't stop grinning when he heard it. Every evening after supper, she would sit by the fire with her books open, reading aloud while Tom listened. "Did you know," she said one night, "that stars are really far away? Like millions of miles?" Tom nodded. "I did know that. But they look close, don't they? Kind of like people. You never know how far they've been till they shine." She looked at him with admiration. "You say things in such a nice way," he chuckled. "That's just years of talking to animals." Life settled into a rhythm that felt like family. They celebrated small things. Her birthday, the first tomato from the garden, and even the day Daisy had a foal. They named the foal Lucky, because that's what Lila said she felt every day. But one thing still lingered in Tom's heart. He had never officially adopted Lila. In the eyes of the town, she was just the girl who lived with him. But in his heart, she was already his daughter. One afternoon, he drove to the courthouse and filled out the papers. When he came home, he found her in the barn brushing Daisy's mane. "Lila," he said softly, holding an envelope in his hands. "I've got something to show you." She turned, her eyes curious. "What is it?" He handed her the paper, and she read the words slowly. Then her eyes widened and her lips trembled. "You mean I'm really yours?" Tom nodded, his voice low and warm. "You've been mine since the day I found you. This just makes it official." Lila dropped the brush and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I love you, Tom." He hugged her close, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you too, sweetheart." After that day, everything felt different, yet more complete. The townsfolk smiled when they heard the news. Some even brought small gifts like books or dresses for her. Mrs. Hargrove baked a pie and said, "She's one of us now," and she truly was. Months passed, and autumn painted the trees with red and gold. Lila had grown into a happy, confident girl who laughed often and helped everyone around her. She still carried her gentle ways, feeding stray cats behind the store, helping neighbors with chores, and bringing flowers to the church on Sundays. People admired her kindness, not just her smile. One day, she and Tom went into town for the harvest fair. The same place where people once turned away from her was now filled with friendly faces. Children ran up to greet her, adults waved, and the mayor even gave her a blue ribbon for helping decorate the church. As they stood watching the sunset that evening, Lila looked up at Tom and said softly, Do you remember when people used to cross the street when they saw me? Tom nodded. I remember. She smiled, her eyes glistening. They don't anymore. That's because they finally see what I saw from the start, he said gently. A good heart? She leaned against his arm, watching the fading light. I used to think I was invisible, she said. But you saw me, Tom, even when no one else did. He smiled. Sometimes the hardest thing in life is to look past what the world notices and see what truly matters. That night, back at the ranch, they sat by the fire. Lila read aloud from one of her school books, her voice soft and steady. Tom listened, the warmth of the flames flickering across his face. When she finished, she set the book down and said, I want to be like you when I grow up. Tom chuckled. Like me? You don't want to be an old rancher? She shook her head. Not that part. The part where you help people. I want to help someone the way you helped me. Tom looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. That's the best dream I've ever heard. Years later, people in Maple Hollow would tell the story of the little girl who once lived alone and forgotten, and the rancher who gave her a home. They said she grew into a woman with a heart as big as the sky, one who never turned away from anyone in need. But on quiet evenings, when the stars shone over the wide fields, Tom and Lila still sat together on the porch side by side, remembering where it all began. The wind would rustle through the trees, the horses would breathe softly in the barn, and for a moment, everything in the world felt right. And as Lila looked up at the endless sky, she thought about the long road she had walked, from loneliness to love, from being shunned to being cherished. She smiled, her voice barely a whisper. I finally found where I belong. Tom reached over, patting her hand gently. You always belonged, sweetheart. You just needed someone to remind you. The stars shimmered above them like tiny promises of hope, and the ranch, at once quiet and lonely, was now filled with laughter, light, and the unbreakable bond of two hearts that had found each other in the most unexpected way. And from that day forward, no one ever called her the girl who smelled bad. They called her Lila Callahan, the girl with the brightest smile in town, and the heart that turned one man's empty house into a true home.